2001. It was a simpler time. The PS2 had just launched the year before in North America, and the Xbox and GameCube were slated to release towards the end of the year. The jump from this generation from the last is arguably the biggest we'd ever witness. Games were starting to look and sound amazing, and we were only just 2 years in. Now, I don't know about you guys, but a lot of my exposure to new games in this gen came from looking around in video rental stores. Yeah, I had magazines, but those weren't as frequent as my family trips to Blockbuster. I mention this because it was one trip to Blockbuster during the summer of 2001 where I first saw Dark Cloud. I knew next to nothing about the game outside of the box, but I was just enthralled by seeing it. The art style looked so appealing, the logo was unique, and it looked to be an action-oriented game. And I didn't get to rent it. Time went on, and I would occasionally see magazine ads for the game that just enticed me more and more. But eventually, I was fortunate to get the game when it dropped down to $20. Hey, better late than never, right? Now, some of you might be curious as to why I'm talking about a 20-year-old game. It's not a particularly obscure game, as it did well enough to get a greatest hits release and a PS4 re-release 5 years ago. I bring up Dark Cloud because it is honestly one of my favorite games, and it often feels a bit overlooked nowadays. Usually when somebody compiles a list of some of the best RPGs or action RPGs, it generally never makes the list, unless it's specific to PS2 games or some other filter. Even when Dark Cloud does appear on these articles, it is generally outshined by its sequel, but I am here to make the case that the original is still worth loving after nearly 20 years. Now, Dark Cloud is not an RPG that sticks out for its story. The plot is quite simple, but effective in making sense of its design choices. Allow me to explain. You see, the central conflict starts when this evil Nigel Thornberry type decides that he wants to have a Majin Buu of his own, so that he may take over the world. As you do, of course. This is done, of course, by having people thriller dance around a giant magic lamp as part of an evil summoning ritual. Again, as you do. Once summoned, the evil Jim partners up with the evil militant, and the duo just immediately decide to demonstrate their power by laying waste to several villages, including the one where the protagonist, Tone, lives, all while Norine village is having a festival too. The structure collapses, and in a display of heroism, Tone sacrifices himself to save the life of a friend. Instead of dying, Tone finds himself being awakened by Simba, the Fairy King. Yes, his name is Simba, but anyways, the Fairy King explains that all the village people, houses, and miscellaneous property weren't destroyed. Rather, he managed to seal them away in Atlaspheres just in the nick of time. The Fairy King gives Tone the Atlamelia Stone and tells him that he must help find all the Atlaspheres so that he may literally restore the world by building it back up again and working his way to help seal the ancient evil. Now, it wouldn't be a typical RPG without you assembling your own party, like Chao, the slingshot-using cat girl, Goro, the heavy-hitting hunter, Ruby, the spell-casting genie, Ungaga, the mid-range spear user, and Osmond, the gun-using moon rabbit. The game's a little weird, I admit, but irregardless of the simple story, the premise does function as a creative framing device for Dark Cloud's two principal mechanics: dungeon crawling and town building. The dungeon crawling is the primary gameplay focus in the sense that it's what you'll be doing the most. The game has 6 areas, 7 if you include the post-game. Each one has a dungeon with a set amount of floors for you to cover until you reach that dungeon's boss. With the exception of event and boss floors, they are all randomly generated. The primary goal of each floor is to find all the Atlaspheres before obtaining the key to the next area. Rinse and repeat. Now, believe it or not, the game actually manages to keep the dungeon crawling interesting through its enjoyable, if rather simple, combat mechanics, and by occasionally shaking things up in the dungeon floors by imposing little stipulations here and there. Each character plays differently and has different skills that play into the design. Tone, being the general sword dagger user, is the most balanced and is the only one able to collect Atlas Spheres. Chao is your first ranged weapon user and is capable of crossing gaps with her cat-like reflexes, so long as there's a convenient platform in the middle anyways. Goro does the big damage, but is slower. He can also activate switches by hitting them with his hammer. Ruby throws energy spheres. She's stronger than Chao, but slower. She can also activate crystals, so long as she can match the element. Ungaga is the mid-range between Tone and Goro, with speed and strength, but with better melee range. Ungaga can spin little mini tornadoes to blow away dark clouds sealing your path, like in the name of the game. Lastly, Osmond is all guns blazing, and his ability to fly over gaps, even the ones without the trademark platforms, basically invalidates Chao's character skill. No catgirl love in this game, although Osmond is such a late addition to the party that it doesn't make that much of a difference. As far as the game's combat is concerned, it is a bit slower by action RPG standards. It's not as fast as an Ys game, but not quite as stiff as, say, the Devil Summoner games. Offense-wise, your characters have a limited stat gauge, which tracks how long an attack string you can do. All your characters do have a charge-up attack, but it drains weapon usage faster. If Time Dwell, you can stun lock enemies and prevent them from attacking. Note that this is an essential skill in the early game. Your primary defense strategy is largely going to consist of circle strafing. You can block attacks, but many times you'll find that it's not worth it, as blocks won't prevent hard knockdowns from certain attacks, and it can drain your weapon's durability. Yes, weapons have durability and serve as your main source of character progression. You see, in Dark Cloud, your characters have very few base stats that are unaffected by weapon swapping. That is, your health bar, your thirst gauge, and your base defense. One would argue that this would make Dark Cloud a light RPG affair, but trust me when I say that the weapon growth system has a fair amount of depth. The game allows you to modify your weapon's base attributes, its elemental affinity, and its effectiveness against certain enemy types. Weapons level up and retain attachments that you add on to them, and once they reach level 5 you can break them down into a synth sphere and add it to another weapon. This is a crucial part to the progression system of Dark Cloud. It's not too dissimilar to Persona's fusion system, where personas reach a certain cap, and it becomes more beneficial to fuse your older, lower level personas so that you can work your way to stronger ones down the line. All weapons are capable of being broken, and the game will annoy you with a persistent beeping sound to remind you at every moment. Yes, I know my weapon is at its breaking point. Thank you, game. The only weapons incapable of breaking are your starter weapons, but if they break while at an upgrade state, it drops back to base level. Even without weapons, the game's item system allows you to hold 3 items in your quick selection spaces. So if your good weapon breaks, you can always throw projectiles when needed, or equip auto repair powder or instant resurrection. Also, maybe this is just me, but always use Dran's Feather, unless you like clearing dungeons at a snail's pace. RNG is a huge factor in this game. As mentioned earlier, every floor is randomly generated, and that includes item and enemy placement. Revisiting the same floor will result in a different layout, so item chests will contain different items, enemy types will change based off floor, and enemy drops will change too. You might have a dungeon run where you immediately get the dungeon key, but other times, it might be down to the very last monster. It's truly the luck of the draw with this game. Where RNG can both improve or screw over your playthrough is through weapon boxes. Weapon box frequency varies so much between dungeon visits, just as much as the weapon rarity can. No joke, during one of my very first playthroughs, I actually got a high level hammer for Goro that made real quick work of the early level bosses, but in all subsequent playthroughs, I never got it again. Hell, during the making of this video, I went to the first dungeon only getting a small sword for Tone and 1 slingshot for Chao. The game tries balancing this by having back areas available. So long as you can acquire the key to make it there, the game raises the probability of high rewards at the cost of higher risk. Also, as briefly mentioned earlier, the game also introduces stipulation elements on certain floors to make it interesting. Stipulations like your character dehydrating quicker, or weapons being cursed and unable to be swapped. One of the most common ones in the game script are floors where one of your party members is permitted. It's the game's way of ensuring that you don't fall into the easy RPG trap of only leveling up the main character. So, my advice, make sure you have a balanced party. Now, I did also mention that one of the other prominent features in Dark Cloud is the town building simulation. As the game's opening section alludes, you, the player, as Tone, can reshape the villages that were presumed destroyed, and beyond just reassembling them, you can make them better. There are progression elements with regards to the town building stuff. For one, you'll have to collect all the Atla, which may hold a person, a piece of furniture, or even a whole house. Atla are basically like the Capsule Corp capsules, in the sense that they seemingly have no limit as to how large the object can be that they can store, but it is limited to one item. Huge asterisks on the houses with various furniture already in them. In the viewer, you're given vague descriptions as to who goes where, but you'll find that some spaces in the house will be marked with a question mark. These are the ones you'll have to ask the villagers for. For every step of completion, you'll receive rewards. The early ones will be scattered all over the properties that you help reassemble. Once they're finally done, you can even trigger cutscenes where you'll be rewarded by the villagers themselves. Some will expand your item pouch, others will give you items, some may traumatize you into seeing the future. The usual. But wait, there's more. Even after recovering all the Atla in the dungeon and assembling the village, you can go further by reinventing the village and by rearranging all the houses to the people's desire. Whether that means living closer to someone, living further from someone, being surrounded by water, or facing the sun, netting a 100% villager satisfaction rate gets you more rewards. Now, you'd think that arranging the villages to these conditions might stifle creativity, but not too much. You can still achieve unique layouts and still accomplish that 100% clear rate. Throw down roads however you like, pepper the earth with all the happy little trees, or just leave it barren to the point of hitting the bare minimum requirement to progress. The world is truly your oyster. It's hard to exactly state why I think this game is overlooked, or why exactly it's one of my favorites. In many ways, this game is very much a product of its time in both good and bad. I think the art direction of this game saves it a lot from a visual standpoint by not shooting for photorealism and instead opting for this subdued anime-like art style. But its textures and text quality are pretty emblematic of this CRT-driven era. The game has semblances of being a tech demo through its focus of randomly generated dungeons and by sticking to a real-time rendering, as the PS2 generation was trying to distance itself from the era of pre-rendered backgrounds. The game can be partially played in first person, if desired, but it's an element that was added so you can investigate the real-time environment and time change more so than for the dungeon crawling. The game can both be grindy or not, depending on so many RNG factors which can determine how breezy or tiresome a playthrough can be. And for a genre that is largely defined by sweeping narratives, this one has a fairly simple fairy tale one with no real frills. So why do I always come back to Dark Cloud? And why do I still hold it so fondly after all these years? Personally, I still find this game to be amazingly fun after all these years because each playthrough I go through can vary wildly from one another. It's a game that lends itself incredibly well to replays by design because the drops and dungeons are being randomized. The fact that the game has a charming atmosphere created through its wonderful art direction, its interesting soundtrack, and its characters, all of them, even down to the basic villagers that you meet in every area. It's hard to define, but that charming aesthetic is what initially drew me into the game and has kept me coming back ever since. The game is so ingrained into my memory that I honestly couldn't imagine it any other way. Despite the flaws, Dark Cloud is a game I will continue to revisit because it means that much to me. It's almost inexplicable, but much like how it drew me in the first place, its charm is in its simplicity. I hope to continue playing this game for many years to come. Who knows? It could very well give me another 20 years of enjoyment. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I want to give a special thank you to NetLexia for drawing my brand new avatar. If you like her art, feel free to check her out. Her socials will be listed below.